Thank you very much to everyone for joining us tonight. I know we've got quite a few people in the room. There are some spare chairs towards the front. There are always some spare chairs towards the front for whatever reason people don't want to sit in the front. Thank you for joining us. Happy International Men's Day. It is International Men's Day, which was started several years ago to put a focus on men's mental health. But we at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership have been routinely having events on International Men's Day now because we know gender equality benefits everyone. We know we won't reach gender equality without men and boys walking the pathway as well. And because our polling data over a number of years now has shown that there is reason to be concerned about the retrenchment in attitudes towards gender equality generally, but with a particular focus on young men. So tonight we're going to do a dive into some other very recent information to pull out some of the threads that help us understand what's going on attitudinally and what we need to focus on now as we continue to campaign for a more gender equal world. So the format of tonight will be research presentations. Now, no need to get overly concerned at the word research. It will be very digestible. I think you will actually find it completely intriguing. And we will then have a panel to talk about the issues coming out of the research, but also to canvass issues more broadly. So I'm going to introduce you at this stage to the three people who will be presenting the research. Professor Bobby Duffy, who leads the Policy Institute here at King's College London, and for those of you who have been to other events, including Policy Institute events, Bobby will be very well known to you. Gideon Skinner, who is a Senior Director at Ipsos, which is the polling company that we have partnered with for a long period of time now, and we're very grateful for that continuing partnership. And my colleague, Professor Heejung Chung, who is the Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So the three of them will present the research to you. Then I will come back up and introduce the panel and we'll get on with the panel discussion. So please, in whatever order you've agreed. And this is not the easiest navigation in the world. We might move that once we've done the research presentations. Thanks, Bobby. Sorry, Gideon.
Right,
I'm sitting on top
thank
of
you so much, Julia, and it's brilliant to be here with such a mixed audience from different organisations to look at this. I'm going to give you my quick rundown on the research that we've released just today. And as Julia says, it's part of a long-running series of studies that we do with Ipsos, our great partners at Ipsos, on culture wars specifically. So we've done about 12 or 13 of these studies. And it uses Ipsos's knowledge panel, which is this big random probability panel. So this is not your normal kind of polling. It's very rigorous and reliable. So we actually did a release a couple of weeks ago, which was under this heading. This was on more general culture war change. So, and the headline for the press release was Sense of Division Reaches New High, and this was absolutely lapped up by the media. So we got wall-to-wall coverage of this release, which you may have seen. The one that we've released just today for International Men's Day had this as a headline: more in common than divides young men and women. And we got a slightly less engagement from the media. I mean, bless Mirage News, which I think is Australian, bless Mirage News and Bloomberg UK, although Bloomberg's piece was about 18 paragraphs down within their pieces on this. So, I mean, look, this is maybe an unfair comparison because that study, the big study that we did a couple of weeks ago, was really shocking. And if people haven't seen it, do have a look. It's about big changes in culture wars. And it's kind of got a broader emphasis. But having said that, we did a piece on division among young men and women as part of this series back in 2023, and that got wall-to-wall coverage as well. That was one of the first studies that started to show the interest in Andrew Tate among young men. Everyone covered that. So I think there is an element of this which is division sells in the media and in discussions. And that's one of the themes of today. Second, one of the other kind of cross-cutting themes is it's always important to put these sorts of things in context, and that's why it's so good to have this series of studies with Ipsos. So we, in the biggest study, asked about divides across all sorts of things, not just gender, with this kind of key question: how much tension, if any, would you say there are between the following groups in the UK? And we get this sort of pattern, with incredible and rising tension between immigrants, perceived tension between immigrants and people born in the UK, supporters of different political parties going up again, climate change skeptics and believers starting to come through, and this first time we've asked that, different social classes, still a key source of division, leavers and remainers still up there but going down over time, as you might expect, and then younger and older generations, and men and women are right at the bottom of this list. This is not the divisions between men and women in this context of culture wars more generally is not a key dividing line. And then related to building on that, we need to remember that there is a lot of common ground and seem to be a lot of common ground between men and women. So when you ask people which is closest to your view, young men and women have more in common than divide them, or vice versa. In the purple, we've got the more in common, and there's a lot more purple on this sort of chart than there is blue. There is, as you see, slightly less purple, slightly more blue for women, young women on this. And this is a theme that runs throughout the research, and Heejung and Gideon will pick up on a little. And we can see that in the tension question as well that I showed first. And this is two things to keep in your mind throughout this. When I'm saying that this is not a key dividing line, that doesn't mean there's zero tension between the groups. And then there is this theme that we see that young women have a greater sense of that tension between men and women than men do, young men do. And we can see that here. So young women are the only group where a majority, 6 and 10, say that there is at least some sort of tension between men and women today. So that is a theme that we will pick up as we go through. And it is also true that there is some sense of resentment from young men in the UK as well. So we asked this question, just an agree, disagree. Guys can have their reputation destroyed just for speaking their minds these days. And we got half of young men agreeing with that. This is the 18 to 29-year-old group agreeing with that. So that, in some sense, could have been our headline for the press release. If we put out a press release saying half of young guys think they could have their reputation destroyed for just speaking their mind these days, that probably would have got a lot more coverage. But this is, again, where context is really important. We really wouldn't normally ask a question asking about guys. The only reason we've asked guys in this is because it's a US study that we mirrored. So comparing the UK and the US, you can actually see much higher feelings of sense of threat to reputation from what you say in the US compared to the UK. So if you just did this in the UK, you could have got a completely different headline from seeing that actually in context, much less of that feeling in the UK than the US. And it also cuts both ways. The US study only asked about guys. It didn't ask about it from a woman's perspective, but we did ask that in the UK. So this is the guys' data that you've just seen. And when you ask it for women can have their reputation destroyed just for speaking their minds these days, you actually get higher agreement with that. So more of a sense among women than men, which just goes to say, I mean, this is the key theme from my session on this, is that context really matters, and us looking for division and cherry picking individual elements of signals of division is a real concern and does change the nature of the debate, unfortunately. So if young women do have a greater sense of tension, which is true, and we see that across lots of other findings in the study, for young men it's a different type of issue. It's dire levels of optimism. And one of my strands of work is a lot on generational differences, and it's well known to me and lots of other people working in generations that we've got this real collapse in a sense of generation on generation progress. Used to be in the early 2000s, you get a majority of people saying things are going to be better for young people than their parents. But since the financial crisis, it's been reversed, where you get just a small minority of people thinking it's going to be better. But what I hadn't quite clocked in all of that work, really, is just how different it is across genders within generations. So this asks about men and women separately from men and women in their parents' generation. And young women actually have a relative optimistic sense of comparing themselves with women in their parents' generation. They do think things will be better, and that might be a reflection on how bad it was for women in those parents' generation, but it still leaves this point that it's so much lower among young men, that sense of optimism about young men. This is everyone's views, whether things are going to be better or worse for young men today compared to men in their parents' generation. And you can see the young men line in particular, only 20% of young men thinking it's going to be better for them than it was for men in their parents' generation. 40%, twice as many, think it's going to be worse. And this is really important. That sense of decline is something that we see across culture war work that we do. It's really related to other very destructive trends in terms of people, the rise of populism, the rise of people just wanting to rip up the system because they've got nothing to lose, nothing to risk here. So that's a key signal. So given that is a general impression among the public as a whole, not just among young men themselves, it's not surprising then that the public actually want some responses to these challenges that young men see for themselves, and they want practical responses to the challenges facing young men and boys. So across the list of types of activities, these are the ones that the public would prioritise. More investment in youth services, mentorship schemes, community clubs, lots of the things that people on the panel and in this room will be working on. Providing more support services specifically for men on things like mental health, and having a men's health strategy is a great step forward in the last couple of days. Great support for fathers, reforming the family court system, promoting positive role models in the media, more focus on schools, on the specific challenges that boys face, and encouraging more men to become primary and secondary teachers. A whole range of different things at slightly different levels. No one clear solution here. People recognizing this is a multifaceted problem. The only one that's not at all popular is this one, appointing a government minister for men, which is probably a reflection, a slightly unfair question to include that within this list of very practical things, but probably a bit of a reflection on people wanting things to change, not just political actions on this. Just from the things that I take from this, from looking across culture wars work, across generations work, not just specifically on this, is it's one of those real challenges where we need to keep several things in mind at once, which is really tough when you're thinking about public opinion. This is not a major divide in any culture war if we do have emerging, sadly, looks like emerging culture war type framing in the UK. But that doesn't mean that there's not any new tension at all. There is some new tensions coming through here, or that there are no real concerns among young women, real material concerns among young women. But at the same time as that doesn't mean young men don't need more targeted support. All of those things can be true together, and keeping it in our minds like that is really important. Because of this very final point, how we talk about this is as important as what we say on this. It's the approach to this is so important to not increase that sense of division and create the problem that we're trying to solve. We need less oxygen to extreme figures and views, fewer divisive debates that pit one against the other, and in the end, more focus on practical actions. Thank you.
Hi. So we're going to do like a rotation, like a relay of presentation. So I just wanted to kind of pick back up on some of the things that was mentioned by Bobby, especially around, like, there was this one group that really felt like there still is a tension, which is young women. And I just wanted to kind of pick why that might be the case. And I think, you know, as many of you know, this past year especially has been there has been a lot of kind of hit on like EDI issues, equality issues, and a lot of headlines around a lot of people believing that gender equality has just gone too far to the point where discriminating against men, etc. And I think that's one of the reasons in terms of what we see in terms of corporate policy, government policies, especially across the Atlantic, and kind of some of the backlash narratives. And so we've asked so how much do you think, what is the proportion of population who believes that gender equality has gone too far? And this is just the prediction of the average. So people believe that approximately 42% of the British public will think that, gender equality has gone too far, and especially it was amongst men, and especially that young men and older men, but 42% of young men would think that gender equality has gone too far. And these kind of perception, I think, fuel the idea that for young women, that there is a great deal of tension between men and women, young men and women. But the reality is that actually that kind of attitude doesn't actually exist. So as you can see here, obviously young men, young women, only 6% believe this to be the case, but even young men, they are slightly higher than young women, also slightly higher than the older men, but only 1 out of 5 young men feel like gender equality has gone too far. Kind of similarly, one of the other kind of things that are in the kind of the media and in a lot of debates is about how we talk about these issues. So toxic masculinity, for example, used a lot, very commonly, to discuss some of these problems that young women face in terms of gender violence, discrimination in the workplace, unequal power distribution in society, etc. And obviously this isn't about attacking men, but some other cultures that are embedded, let's say, in masculine organizations, as well as society that really hinder not only women, but also men. But as we can see here, young women still believe that it is a really good term to address and, the issues that we have. Again, not men per se, but the masculine culture. But as we can see here, young men, 40% of young men disagree, and this is kind of where the tensions lie. But I think looking at these figures, we might end up believing, and this is really important, I think social norms about what we think other people think is absolutely crucial in determining and framing our own ideas and attitudes. Do then young men dare against the notions of toxic masculinity? Are they then unaware of gender equality issues? Then that's the question that we're asking in the next slide. So we have asked this question: has feminism done, better, more good than harm, or more harm than good? And what we see in 2023, only about a third of young men said it has done more good than harm, whereas in 2025 we see a huge increase, the biggest increase across all groups, which is 46%. Close to half of those who were polled said that it actually has done more good. So actually we have seeing not only young men acknowledging the issues that women are facing, but also accepting feminism as a way in which we could address some of these gender inequality issues. Similarly, we have asked, do you think it's harder to be a man or a woman in today's society? And again, only about a third said it's harder to be a woman, whereas by 2025, we see that it's close to half of young men. So, and in our International Women's Day survey that we conducted across the globe, and we published in March of this year, we also note about certain aspects of, against violence, about, political kind of representation, et cetera, et cetera. And if we ask people, hey, do you think, who has more power, who is actually facing a lot of these issues, young men are very, very much aware of the problems that young women are currently facing. But the problem then lies, it's about, again, our social expectation of what society wants us to do and what we want to do. And really, one of the things that we wanted to see is what are the things around gender roles? What is your role in society? Because I think one of the key things that we still have a lot of tension on, and a lot of young men are really being pressured to do, is that they are still feeling the burden of needing to be the financial contributor, the breadwinner. And that really puts heavy burden on men in terms of, we know that the job markets are becoming more insecure, they're not being paid well, so that kind of leads them also to thinking, oh, I'm not gonna be able to have, get into a relationship, get married, or have children. And so we asked people, what proportion, so how, do you think it's still men's responsibility, societally? So do you think society still think it's men's responsibility to do the breadwinning? And approximately 36% says, yes, society thinks that it is men's roles. And if you look at young men, that goes up to about 54%. More than half of young men feel like it is still men that are expected to do the breadwinning. But in reality, if you say, what do you think? What do you feel like? For both men and women, who should do the breadwinning? Majority said it should be equally shared. So it is actually both young men and women feel like this is a role that both men and women should take part in. Similarly, who should be doing the housework and childcare? 46% say, oh, it's probably a woman's role, that society thinks it's a woman's role to do domestic labor, whereas majority, and we're seeing this across so many different surveys, fathers want to be in part of the care, they want equal care, they want to be equally involved in caregiving and housework. Maybe not so much housework, but at least the caregiving. And what we're seeing again is that a lot of the tension perhaps is coming from the fact that we still have assumed social norms that are pressuring young men and women to behave in a way that they do not want to. Again, if we are asked people, have you felt like you had to act a certain way to meet other people's expectations of your gender? Obviously, this could go both ways. So it's like, I'm actually more conservative, but I had to act egalitarian, or I'm egalitarian, but I had to act conservative. And we don't know, but looking at the previous slide, we kind of assume that young men and women want to break out of these traditional roles and traditional norms of gender, maybe breadwinning, caregiving, but also about, you know, the activities or the kind of characteristics they have. But again, like more than half of young men and women, and especially young women here as well, feel like they are unable to do that. And again, this may be the assumed social norms about what they need to be like, maybe it's kind of the source of tension. So I'm gonna leave it here for now, and Gideon's gonna kind of continue on. So, yeah.
Thanks, Heejung. Thanks, Bobby. Thank you all for coming and listening to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of our work does tell us about the challenges that young men think they're facing more in their kind of daily, day-to-day lives. But it is important, as both Bobby and Heejung have said, that it's possible for two things to be true at once. We asked this question in our study: do you think society undervalues or overvalues the views of different groups? And these are the figures for young men and young women. And it is true that young men at the top, half of them think that society undervalues the views of young women. So they think that, but they also think that their own views are undervalued too. Actually, slight difference between young women are less sure that young men's views are undervalued than men feel the other way. But there is a sense that young men can feel both. They can be concerned about undervaluing of women's views, but also worry about themselves. As an aside, the group who society thinks is least valued of all are older women. So I'm sure Bobby will be organising events about that imminently, whereas views of older men like myself, the public rightly thinks are grossly overvalued. So young men are aware of the issues facing younger women, but they also perceive challenges themselves. Heejung has talked about that, the sort of the gendered expectations that young men can feel as well as young women. So we've carried out another series of research around modern masculinity for Joe Media, and we've tried to delve into different aspects of men's lives to understand these challenges a bit more. So one of them is around socialising. So we asked people, how many friends do you have and of what gender? Actually, we find that young men, who are always the top bar in these charts, young men say they have more friends than young women do, and older people. Young men also say they have more friends of the opposite gender than young women do. Young men also, 2 in 3 of them, say they're comfortable being open about personal issues with their friends. Young men actually find it easier to be open with people of the opposite gender than young women do. Everyone can talk to women, apparently not everyone can talk to men. So, you know, there is a sense that men feel like they have friends, but despite that, if we're talking about socialisation, issues that men might face, mental health, as many young men, half of young men say they feel lonely at least once a month, which is the same as a proportion, pretty much the same as a proportion of women. So despite the fact that they feel they have more friends, they still feel more lonely, and they feel more lonely than older people. We also asked about dating. Half of young men and half of young women think it is harder for people of their gender to date today than it was 20 years ago. And what we can see, though, if we look into the differences a bit more, is certain tropes where young men are more likely to believe in. So, for example, half of young men think it's true that the majority of women are only attracted to a small subset of men. Almost 4 in 10 young men think it's true that a man who does not contribute more to the household finances than his partner is less of a man. We asked about what characteristics do people think women find attractive. Men, young men particularly, are much more likely to think that issues such as looks and financial status are important to women. Fortunately, for some of us at least, that's not the case. Young women say it's more things like kindness, communication, honesty, and young men think those attributes are undervalued. We also find in this, young men are particularly concerned about social media and dating apps. We also find that young men are more likely than other groups to use AI tools for advice in their personal life, which brings me on to social media. Both young men and young women rely on social media. The majority of both say it's their dominant source of news and information. But young men, the top bar each time, remember, they're much more likely to trust what they see on social media as a reliable source. Of course, much of the time it may well be. It's not just to slag it off, but they do trust social media much more than other groups, even though about the same proportion of them are concerned about misinformation. And just finally on this, so what we end up finding is that 4 in 10 young men, and the same proportion of young women, say they are addicted to social media. But actually, young men are much less likely to say they are prepared to spend less time and want to spend less time on social media despite that. Maybe because they're worried about missing out, losing out, they're finding the habit hard to break, and so on and so forth. So they are worried about the impact of social media, but are they able to act on it and take steps to counteract it? So that just finishing off really, I think all this shows that we do need to understand all these pressures, these societal pressures, these day-to-day pressures, these gendered expectations on young men, the impact of the financial crisis, the real-world issues that they are facing, if we can help come up with some of the practical solutions that Bobby was talking about. But just to leave on something marginally more positive, something slightly more positive, we do find that the vast majority of young men at least do say they have a positive role model and positive male role model to look up to, and most young women also feel the same. So there are role models out there, just needs to be boosted with some of the practical solutions that we talked about. Thank you very much.
Well done. The very crowded stage is causing issues. Thank you to our 3 presenters for intriguing, in some ways, some confounding bits of research. We're now going to move to a panel discussion of that research, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from the audience. I'm going to start firstly with Chloe. Chloe is the Deputy Director of Research at Equimondo, and I'm sure, Chloe, you noted that in the research presentation there is a hankering by the community for practical solutions for men, and right at the top of what was being pointed to as a good practical solution was community centres. Now, I know that this is right up your alley and what you think about. So can you talk to us about how in your work you see the importance of those kinds of connections for young men?
Sure, yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Apologies for coming in, destroying glasses as I came. But yeah, really brilliant to be in the room with you all. Thank you for that opening question. So we, at Equimondo, Centre for Masculinity and Social Justice, I don't know how much you know about us, we're a US-based organisation who do work globally, and in recent years have turned our attention kind of from that more global work towards the US and the UK as well, and sort of changing, challenging and concerning trends that we're seeing. We're research driven, and so my wheelhouse is very much on the research side of things, but we do use our research to drive our work both online and in practice. And we really see the importance of healthy relationships offline, kind of having really quite important effects kind of in terms of sense of safety in the world and belonging. So we recently just did a study in the UK that we launched on Friday, and saw that across these times of division, there seems to be a real sense of support for the idea of having more resources in community centres, which was reflected in some of the data here as well. So across 80%, I think, of our sample supported the idea of having more community centres invested in. That feels particularly important in the context of the UK, given that just years of austerity seen many of our community centres be decimated. Sort of feeling a little bit stuck on what to say more in terms of the importance for us of community and belonging, say more on the research side, but I'm feeling very inspired and wanted to share the work of the Global Fund for Children. I don't know if anybody in the room is here from Global Fund for Children, who do a lot of community-based work, including in the UK, and who recently shared some of their work, including with a young man from the north who had been, I guess, recruited into a far-right kind of network, as well as a young man on the panel who'd been recruited into a gang network in East London. And it was the most remarkable thing to see them both on the panel, and both had been pulled out of those, out of the far-right network and the gang space through a community centre. Which just, again, showed the importance of that sense of belonging, a sense of feeling cared for, and then sort of inspire, that somebody's invested in your life. Which brings me back also to some of the findings of our surveys here too, and I'm sure we'll talk about the links to a sense of the importance of sense of community and feeling invested in, and a sort of disconnection from sort of political investment that we're seeing at the moment. So our survey asked a whole number of questions, but two that came together in quite complementary ways, well, they're quite striking in their different findings. So one was, I feel I have somebody in my life who is invested in my future, and that could be a family member or a friend, and quite similar to the findings we saw here, about sort of 3/4 said that they did have sort of believed that they had somebody in their lives who cared about their future. We then asked, I believe that my political leaders are invested in and care about my future. And there, the findings basically mirrored and went the other way, sort of a sense of actually not feeling cared for and invested in by their political leaders in their future. So all sort of roundabout way to say, this clearly points to the importance of people feeling the need to feel more heard by their political leaders, and that includes very much for young men. And we'll be happy to share more about findings and how this connects to sort of purpose later on.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, and we will keep the discussion going, but I'm going to ask you, given you've got that deep insight into the US, and we saw in the research that the division questions are worse in the US. Now, this is in some ways an unfair question because it's unlikely to have an evidence-based research response, but is your sense that the US is just different, or is your sense that, like in many other cultural and political areas, the US is pointing to the shape of things to come? What happens in the US first, then, for better or worse, waves throughout the world. Have you got a sense about that?
It's something we're thinking about very carefully. So we haven't done a close comparison, but in preparation for this evening, I did kind of go back to our State of US Men's Study, which came out just a few months ago, with some of the questions that you saw reflected there too. So it's really exciting to have these two studies come out at such similar times for the UK. It's sort of great to start to sort of be in conversation. I can't wait to really nerd out and compare notes. So I think some of our findings were quite similar and complementary. Some were a little bit different. So for us, the picture out of the UK was kind of not as divergent from the US, which I was really curious to sort of dig into that a little bit more. But areas that we did see, I think like for us in the UK, as in the US, we saw some resonance of sort of what we call harmful online narratives, so sort of red pill, gender threat ideas, seemed to be quite appealing here as well as in the US. The ones that had slight differences included the fact that, but only a small percentage, so the fear of being cancelled came out higher in the UK in our study, but only 3% lower than in the US. I think it's about 71% of young men said they.
So it's higher, the fear
So
of
it's
being
higher
cancelled in the UK.
In the UK in our survey. So again, interested to sort of compare notes. It was about 68% said that they were concerned that they could lose their reputation for speaking their minds these days, and 71% for the US. I think there's a kind of a landscape of precarity that comes into play, and there's a slight, I mean, to your question of US versus UK, I think we need to pay really close attention. As I was doing the UK study, I wanted to frame it around this idea of the tipping point. I was like, we're seeing what's happening in the US, and I think there are some trends that are sort of pulling in similar directions, and that includes around economic precarity and a sort of sense of like a purpose. And we know that in the UK, the economic and employment landscape is looking pretty bleak, but that even for young men who have jobs, they're sort of feeling like those jobs aren't giving them a sense of status and respect. And so we saw something similar in the US, where 59% of men who have jobs said that they don't feel that it gives them a sense of status or respect, and it was 48% in the UK. So we're sort of seeing that could go in a similar direction, I think worth paying attention to, because as Heejung talked about in presentation as well, I think an idea of a sense of masculinity and potentially some form of healthy masculinity is still very connected, to the idea of being a provider, to having meaning, kind of both within the home increasingly, which is a real glimmer of hope that we see in our study too, but also to having some meaning outside the home as well. And I think we do need to sort of be paying attention to some of that. So to say, please do go and read the report. It's quite extensive, but it does show that some of these harmful ideas do have quite significant resonance in the UK, and that is having quite clear implications for views of politics and democracy as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring Lee into the conversation now. Welcome, Lee. Lee is the founder of Male Allies UK. Now, Lee, we know from the research, and you know from your work, that a lot of young men and boys feel that their struggle is due to women and girls getting ahead, and that they're not being supported in the same way that they believe women and girls are being supported. I mean, how do you in your work set out to change that narrative around who is getting support and who has got the capacity to get ahead?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation, and naturally a lot of our work sits around allyship skills in the workplace, how we close those gender gaps, and working with men on that skill set, understanding how they engage in inclusion, what the barriers are and what the benefits are when men do. But we've also done a research project with boys in schools over the past 7 months to understand how they're navigating the world. They're not far from the workplace themselves. And one of the things that we did see within that is a gradual feeling that actually the world is getting harder for boys and not necessarily for girls from their perspective. What we did is obviously create listening sessions beyond that to really understand why did they feel or think that way, and why did they have that perception. And it was interesting giving that space to firstly listen to them, because many of them were like, actually, what, you're going to listen to me share things that might be a little bit controversial? And I'm like, yeah, that's the space that we're in here. Now, it's really interesting to kind of unpack the variety of different perspectives on why that might be. Some of the boys had heard things around workplace dynamics from adults, about how there might be things such as diversity hires. And it's very interesting to hear a 13-year-old boy talk about something like that. But then at the same time, there was people running for presidential elections who referred to the other candidate that way. So it has become in terminology that young people are consuming. Some of the young people were suggesting that deeply ties to the point with Chloe around over 80% of the boys that we surveyed, over 1,000 sample size, said that there were not enough physical spaces from their perspective. And that then ties into a certain feeling that access to different activities outside of the gendered norms that girls have, that they start to see them advertised because they're being advertised in areas where children are, that they're starting to see what seems like a perception that there is more available for girls in terms of external school activities. And what that does is give them a perception that girls have access to all these things now. They've got skateboarding and engineering lessons and the massive expanse of things, which is vital because we need to close those dream gaps that girls have and appreciate that girls need to be represented in every area of life. The challenge is for a lot of young boys, they've not necessarily got a wider perception of why feminism exists, the different waves, the structures, and have not necessarily seen some of the impacts of gendered barriers and gender stereotypes in their own lives in a way that makes sense to them. So for them, it seems like there's lots suddenly for girls, feels like less for us, scarcity, and then the question in the fairness. But I think that one thing that really kind of stands out from that work with boys is actually there is a lot of them care, but there's a real interesting push for fairness in society. And that is either driving them to be incredibly inclusive in how they operate, setting up diversity forums in the schools, taking the lead on this change, or in some ways feeling disenfranchised at the lack of fairness, and then actively looking for someone to blame. Because it's hard for them to blame a faceless system, but it's much easier for them to be instructed to be victims or outrage to be manufactured within them to blame a certain group of society. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges in bringing people together. But within this, what I've actually seen is if you create the space for these boys to be listened to and they get a chance to actually express what their perceptions are, they're actually then relatively open to being probed with a little bit of curiosity to actually see does that play out when you expand beyond their own little bubble. So I do feel a lot of this work is actually creating that space for boys to be able to explore some of the beliefs that they have, because they're actually quite discerning when you let them map it out a little bit to actually then test it against the world. But I do feel more than ever there's lots of signals that are pushing them towards feeling that they are not getting a fair opportunity. And then they hear some of the stuff that's happening in wider society, whether it's true or it's not, that then makes them start to paint a bit of a picture which doesn't actually meet reality, but does tie into aligning some of their challenges and trying to create a constructive narrative that maybe has one element of truth, and then trying to paint a picture around that, even though there's quite often a lot of misinformation around that too.
And just on the misinformation, I mean, in the research, it was clear that young men do, largely believe that young women are only interested in dating, only find attractive a very small subset of men. So this sort of trope that is in the cultural zeitgeist now that, 80 or 90% of women are kind of chasing 10% of men, and then the rest of the men haven't got any prospect of, having a social life, having a girlfriend, family formation, all the rest of it. Given diversity hire has got all the way into schools, has that perception got all the way into schools? And the research shows very clearly a big thumbs down from young men towards the term toxic masculinity. Do you pick that up in the work that you do, and what language would you use instead?
Yeah, so to kind of take the appearance aspect that has made its way into younger people through trends such as looks maxing, young boys thinking they have to try and optimise every element of how they look to make them more attractive to society. And when they actually do that, they're thinking not just in terms of dating, but in terms of how they're going to be perceived by other men and perceived by society, and the idea of being a success. They also are in a world now where there's a significant consumption around fitness influencers that kind of work in their world with hyper unrealistic body image kind of presentations that are quite often enhanced and highly genetic. And they do look at these individuals and then look at themselves and try and create some kind of constructive comparison, which can be quite damaging to their kind of self-concept and how they feel about themselves. Naturally, there are obviously some other influencers who, interestingly for our kind of segment of 11 to 13-year-old boys, the traditional names that often come up are actually becoming less relevant to them, and they feel that those particular creators, or however you want to frame them, are older, less relevant. And we had one 12-year-old boy say a certain well-known influencer was bald, spent his time smoking cigars and drinking whiskey, and that was what his granddad liked to do, not him. But some of the rhetoric around suggesting that young men are losing power and control, and the way to gain it back is through dominance of others and through deciding that you are going to make yourself a certain way, is not allowing these boys to actually explore the whole of the potential that they can be, the wider aspects of them being a man. So some of that physical appearance stuff, we know the significant challenges around body image for girls, definitely, and the relative online harm that's been created. And that's before we head off into the world of intimate image abuse and the many other things that women tend to face. Boys tend to face this less, but in different and slightly insidious ways. And I do feel, that's something that does come up in our conversations. It's just this feeling of not being adequate from a physical presence perspective, based on many of the things that they've seen. And then to the additional point around, obviously, what's interesting is most young boys do not walk around talking about masculinity, patriarchy, misogyny, the manosphere. They don't sit around on the break at school talking about these particular concepts. But the reality is these particular concepts have now entered their world through the social media and the influencers that they follow, even when those influencers are things to do with fitness and sport and music and gaming. And quite often, we've had a lot of young boys kind of say to us, I very rarely see masculinity without toxic preface in it. And some of the young boys have said, I understand that how the world used to be and things that men used to do, simply not appropriate now. But I'm not a man yet. I've not lived that life and had an opportunity to correct any wrongs or live in a way that's aligned to my own values. But I do feel there's a level of blame being put upon me at the age of 13, 14, when I'm trying to work out who I am in the world, trying to find my place. And they're starting to feel there's lots of negativity channeled towards them. And then all of a sudden there's a comforting voice online saying, actually, it's not your fault. It's these people's fault. And that can be quite challenging for young boys who've not got a lot of lived experience to widen their perspective, or trusted adults. Because we have had a few boys say they don't really need parents telling them what to do. They need emotionally available adults in their lives. And that feels quite insightful from young minds, but actually they are quite discerning. And I do feel, more than ever, that piece around, it's not our work to prescribe what masculinity is for the younger generation. It is our job to create spaces where they can explore the whole man that they can be, and try and help them to actually see that who they are told to be is not necessarily who they need to be, and who they're being told to be isn't who they have to be. Because lots of young boys have actually fundamentally stepped back and said, it's just really confusing. Because there's so many different ways I'm being told, that actually having the space to explore who they are, their values, their strengths, what matters to them, what's meaningful, what they imagine they can be in 10 years as they grow into that, is possibly the most important work in this space.
And building on that, and I'm going to ask Chloe and you to come in on this. I mean, it is confusing. You're talking about young boys being confused. I think we're all confused. And part of the confusion is when we look at the research, we can see that, there is a strong attraction to more positive ways of being, around the questions about should men and women contribute equally to income coming into the household. There was strong agreement around that. There was strong agreement around should men and women be sharing caring responsibilities. I think there was a little bit of scepticism about housework, but at least caring responsibilities. And yet, from what you're saying is coming through your research and your conversations, the lived experience that comes to you, there are all these influences that are pushing men and boys away from realising that better world, the world that they, sort of articulate that they're attracted to in these surveys. And we do know that, boys and young men, there are profound mental health concerns. We saw in the survey that there's loneliness concerns. So, what are the strategies that we've talked about some, but what other strategies are there to sort of enable the realisation of this broader vision of being a man in the world, being in an equal partnership, sharing caring responsibilities? How would you see that, and any insights in the research? And then I'll come to you, Lee.
Yeah, great question, and always wonderful to hear Lee's reflections on his work too. to hear the perspectives of these young minds. I mean, for the UK and the US study, we definitely see that ideas of what it means to be a man seem to be expansive or expanding in ways that I think are really, really positive. But as you said, Julie, can definitely create a sense of pressure and confusion in some way, and can add to that sort of disconnection that we're seeing play out in relationships too. I think in our survey here, we asked two initial starting questions. One was, what does it mean to be a man in the UK today? And that was the first closed question that included 18 possible responses and asked participants, both men and women, to select all that applied. And 14 of those got over sort of kind of over 60% of responses, and I think 10 got over 75%. So the bars were kind of quite long. And again, sort of lovely to see that expansion, that expansive sense, but quite confusing. One of our stories of hope that came through in the midst of the romantic precarity that was very clear in the data was that actually there's a lovely friendship story that comes through for us. So the top attribute of what it means to be a man in the UK today that was selected was being a friend and helping those who need it, and that was both for women and men. So I think there's a lovely piece in that. On this idea of greater kind of support for care work and housework, fatherhood came to sort of quite high, but actually sharing housework and care work came up 83%, which was exactly, again in the UK, which was exactly the same level as being strong. So we see these ideas of kind of what we might call as the shorthand, more traditional ideas of masculinity coming in, kind of at really sort of same levels as these more kind of expansive newer ideas, we could say. So I think we see quite a lot of hope in that, and our work on fatherhood, including in this survey and more broadly, also a really hopeful, positive picture. And 81% of dads who we sampled said that being a dad is the best job in the world, basically the most important job for them, which was great. And similar numbers calling for additional support to juggle work, kind of work life and home life, basically, sort of saying we do want more support to be able to spend more time at home. So we do see a great deal of hope in that. All of that is sitting alongside, say, this, I can't remember who on the panel said that, two truths can exist at once and that we contain multitudes. And I think we're really seeing that play out here, that we seem to be in this transition moment, tipping point moment, with a lot to unpack. But certainly I think supporting men to play, kind of more roles at home for dads in particular, I think is one key strategy. And we're sort of very involved in advocacy and campaigning around paternity leave, with some good strides being seen, hopefully in the UK too. Alongside, I think, this question of friendship and finding opportunities, I think, for women and men together, or for men to sort of to show up for themselves. So I loved your questions that broke down, questions of friendship, including, between women and men, which is something we didn't do. But one thing that seemed slightly different for us is that while being a friend came out as this top, quality and attribute, we also saw that this idea of self-reliance and kind of toughing out challenges alone still seems to be the MO for a lot of the men that we surveyed, which played out in this idea. So we used this man box scale that was sort of first introduced by Paul Kibble and then Tony Borton, that we've used across a lot of our studies, which sort of really shows this double-bind nature of quite rigid ideas of masculinity. And so we see that men who endorse ideas on the man box scale, which are broken down again in the study, tend to report a higher sense of purpose. So there seems to be something about the clarity or certainty or sense of clarity and certainty that comes with, kind of clearer, more rigid ideas of what it means to be a man, that can help support a sense of purpose and meaning in life. But at the same time is correlated with really quite significantly higher suicide rates or suicidal ideation. So this sense of it being a double bind. So on the one hand, kind of providing a sense of clarity and purpose, but also being quite harmful when, kind of tipping over into another piece. And part of that story we think is the sense of self-reliance that comes with that. So I was very intrigued to see, your findings that suggested something a bit similar. But I think in all these sort of sense of strategies, part of this sort of creating opportunities for different kinds of relationships between women and men that maybe go beyond, kind of romantic relationships where a lot of the pressure and expectation seems to be. Because just on the question of expectations and perceptions of what is expected of men in relationships, one of the statistics and findings that came out from our survey, we had an item that was women expect too much of men in relationships these days, and 62% of men agreed with that. A significant proportion of women kind of did agree too, but it was quite significantly higher for men. Which thought, okay, there's some conversations maybe need to be had around what those expectations look like. Yeah.
Thank you. And please, on that, you've already shared some strategies, but from the discussions we've had from the research, there clearly seems to be an attraction to different set of relationships, a more equal set of relationships, and yet all of these barriers to getting there. What more can we be doing?
Yeah, so I think it's quite clear from the boys that we created that space for that they do feel a more expanded version of masculinity is possible, and they're trying to explore that in a very what feels like quite polarised and divided world. There was lots of hope. 1 in 5 boys have carried out a male allyship action just in the past month to step in and actively do something towards creating more equality, challenging other boys' behaviour. There are a lot of boys who, because of the lack of fairness they feel within society, they're actually doing a lot more in the space to try and make things more equal and safer and more inclusive for people in their space. And I think that doesn't really ever get picked up. The sensationalism of the challenges often gets picked up. And I do feel that almost creates a gap in our perspective of how many young people are actually have very liberal, ethical mindsets and are actually really driving forward, whether it be for climate, whether it be for inclusion of people, whether it be for fairness in systems that exist. These young people are actively doing things already. And I reflect back to me being that age, and I definitely wasn't. So there is an aspect there of what gets amplified, especially when talking about this younger age group. And I do feel, again, there's a very small subset of boys who have kind of very aligned to certain ideologies based on a continued priming and manipulation from quite a young age. But they take up a lot of headline space in reality, when in the middle there are so many boys who are in that space trying to work out what their role is in society. They're seeing different role models from their own parents, families, and in wider society, trying to make sense of it. And I think it's really important for all touch points, whether it's parents, creating that proximity in space, being a little bit curious about their worlds without judgment, trying to create a space where we can actually have a collaborative way of coming up with some boundaries and guardrails to protect them, but expand them over time to give them that autonomy and agency to start to express and understand who they are. I think the one thing that really kind of stands out from that particular question is we've seen an increase in this cohort of younger boys around the use of AI companions and girlfriends for companionship, sometimes for romance, but quite often for the desire to build communication skills, because that's how they're being advertised in to young people, as it's going to help you get friends, help you speak to girls. Whenever you're lonely, it's there for you. Your coach in your pocket. And these are being advertised to young people in the very apps, places, content that they already consume and use. I do feel that is a concern in some ways, that we need to potentially look at how we address that in a way that isn't, again, from a place of judgment, but is from a place of curiosity around why they would use it, what they look to get from it. Because I do feel that has the potential to increase division and also build a maladaptive set of communication skills that doesn't work very well in the real world, which can then potentially create even further isolation, over-reliance on that for synthetic empathy and support, or maybe even generate more anger and frustration at people who don't accept being spoken to or communicated to in that way. So I think there's so much I can say, but I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Julia, can I ask a question to all of the panel? Sure. So one of the things that Chloe's report has highlighted, and you've highlighted, and also it's been picked up. So one of the kind of solutions that we think about, but we haven't really talked about, is that there's a lot of things around AI and companionships that's coming up in both of the reports. But also in Chloe's report, we talk about the reasons why we pick up these whole tensions and there's manospheres, because some of the biggest influencers, the people with the most followers and people that young boys identify are, okay, we could be neutral here, but they have a certain notion of masculinity, a certain message that they're presenting. And that's kind of, I think, one of the reasons why these things are happening. And I mean, is this just like they're just following, but they don't actually listen to those dangerous rhetorics within those? And I mean, there's been also studies by UCL and Kent about how if you have an adolescent male, ID on Facebook or these YouTube or something, it only takes days or hours to get manosphere, misogynistic. So the question then is to the whole panel, and it's just I don't really have the answers here. Is this really about the regulation of tech, AI, and technology, or is it that the dangers are not actually that strong, and actually some of the boys that you talk about, maybe they do follow it, but they don't actually believe in those things. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
What did you want? We'll do a sweep across the panel and then we'll come out for questions. Or should we ask AI to give us the answer?
Yeah.
Someone can get their phone on and we'll work it out.
Yeah, really straightforward question from Heejung. I preferred your chairing. That was much more. No, I put this in the context of the broader culture wars work, because I think that is really important. And I would, again, point people back to that first set of research that we released a couple of weeks ago, where we have definitely seen a shift in the UK. And it kind of goes to your question on, is the US our future? Because we have done these culture war studies, brilliant work with Ipsos for 5 years now, and we have been completely the people calming people down, that we're not nearly as divided as you think, and this is all amplified and exaggerated. But in this latest study, something has shifted, and it has been between 2023 and 2025, and that could be all sorts of things, but there's definitely an element of this, which is our information environment has hugely shifted in that time, where things that you would never have thought would be allowed online are not only allowed, but they're amplified now online. So I think you're absolutely, and I'm talking about race and immigration and the big divides that we are seeing, where things that, I never thought we'd get to see that racist language is just allowed on these platforms now, and then encouraged. And I think that has shifted and broken a norm that we are going to really struggle to put back together. It took ages and ages to put together in the first place, and it doesn't just regrow immediately. And I do think, as I say, I don't think this element of divide is in that same sort of category, but it is the same mechanisms that people use to do this. Because in the end, it's a really, really insightful stuff from Chloe and Lee. And I do think that point about not seeing the structural problems, but blaming things on an individual other, has got really strong parallels with immigration and race and other aspects of it. It's much, much easier to blame another. And then final thing I'd say on that is where it ends up is nothing to do with cultural division or disagreement. It ends up, the definition of culture wars is two opposing identities that are so strong that they can't see the other person's side in it. So that is what you definitely want to avoid in any of these kind of mechanisms. And the trouble is, I think there's the information environment is changed so much that, and is so targeted, and all of the things with AI is going to get even more so, that encourages that sense of identifying with just my side and not the other side, because it becomes so enveloping. And that would be my worry about this, and that's why I think it's a really good question, a really tough question about answers, Heejung, but it's exactly the right question on, if we don't deal with that, I don't think we have a chance of shifting other things.
Are there any other reactions to Heejung's question?
I'd love to just plug that my colleague Caroline Hayes is in the room, and so if anybody who wants to have a conversation with her about this later, she leads our online work, and I just wanted to flag that. So we're doing bits of work online, and I think there's lots that can be done beyond regulation, including kind of working with moderators and going into online gaming spaces. We're doing partnering with Movember. We just launched yesterday, our Young Men in Media collective work that we're doing with Movember, funded by the Oak Foundation, which we will effectively be working with predominantly influencers who will be putting out different kind of content to sort of challenge some of the narratives around success for young men being relentlessly rich and ripped, which connects to all kinds of, that overarching narrative, which is really popular online, and, the looks maxing that we heard from Lee coming through, but has very clear connections to what healthy relationships look like, very clear connections, ultimately to kind of ideas of leadership, strength, politics and democracy pieces come through. I think the study that Heejung was mentioning was that it takes 23 minutes or something for some of this harmful content to appear, as well as having very clear implications for mental health. So I think yes to regulation. What that looks like, how we get there, I think is obviously a very challenging question. While we continue that work, I think that there's lots that we can do in terms of very clear strategies, including this Young Men in Media Collective that we're excited about, and the Link Up Lab that, again, my colleague Caroline leads over in the US. Just wanted to plug.
I like that terminology, relentlessly rich and
Ripped.
ripped.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, just a quick thought. So, I think if I reflect on our work and the partners that we work with, one of the things that's really clear is we tend to over-index on the content and under-index on the context of why young boys are actually engaging in this. One thing we have found is obviously digital literacy across the whole population is very, very varied and very different. And I think there's very few people who would say they are fully digitally literate across the whole scale. What we find is some young people have a high level of digital literacy and more critical thinking than we give them credit for, and can be very, very discerning about picking apart the content that they consume. But also what we found is that there is a cohort of boys who, especially towards the companions, they express a level of feeling that they don't necessarily have the secure attachment in their own lives, and that these companions place them as the main character in its interactions, make them feel validated and heard, are always there to respond and to listen, and make them feel that actually they have got something to attach to. And I think especially in those developmental years, that can be incredibly powerful for the good and the challenging. And I think there is sometimes a call there, especially given how many young boys in our research suggested that adults maybe don't listen to them in the way that they should. They always feel like they're being told what to do, and that their adults aren't necessarily present in their own lives. And the truth is, it's very difficult out there. The context is financially, economically and technologically, things are very volatile and very unpredictable, and young people feel that in different ways. That's not a cycle of humanity that we've lived through many times before, but I do think sometimes there's lots and lots of talk of the content that's out there, but not a consideration for the context that young people are living within. And in our sessions, you will have young people talking about inflation. They're not saying inflation, but they're actually talking about how things in their lives are changing in terms of prices and inflating. They are aware of these things, and that makes them ponder about the future and potentially get a little bit scared or frightened about what that might look like, because things have changed so much in the 5 years that they've been alive. And also, many of the boys that we researched with, they were 5, 6, 7 and 8 during the pandemic, and have lost some of that socialisation, maturity, some of that communication skill building, and some of that understanding how your self-concept is built around other children. And I don't think we always consider the impact of that for them as a generation too.
Gideon, did you want to say anything in response to Heejung's question?
I mean, really just to echo what others have said, I mean, the sort of the depressing bits that we found in other research, as Bobby's mentioned, is that we have seen a rise in lack of empathy for people on the other side, a rise in the proportion of people who think that you can't really talk to people on the other political divide for you, that they'll never change their mind, that they're just misinformed. So I definitely agree that lack of empathy and signs of growing lack of empathy, particularly in the sort of political environment, is concerning. There is concern about AI, and there is general belief, particularly in the UK, there is support for more regulation and AI, and a concern that government is sort of falling behind where they are, and based on no evidence whatsoever. But I do agree with at the same time we have to be careful about sort of denying agency to young people, and there will be an element of digital literacy that they will be able to probably surprise us in terms of being able to make some of these judgments themselves, though. So I don't think it's completely bleak, but the broader, amongst the older people like us, there is worrying signs of division.
Okay, lots to think about there. I'm going to go out now for a few questions. I think we've got microphones, so we've got lots, and we're only going to be able to do a few. What I might do is there's one right at the back there, and one here. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. My question refers to the age range classes that I saw on some of the slides, particularly for the younger ones. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of them were as broad as 16 years old to 28. Some might have been 18 to 28, something like that. Now, there's an awful lot going on within that class. And I have children of my own, 24, 26, and I know that their views are very different to those of an 18, 19-year-old. And the 18, 19-year-old has been with TikTok and Instagram ever since. So really the question relates to what is that age range hiding? If you had split that range on those slides, would we have seen more of an extreme set of results? If so, are they possibly related to the Instagrams of this world? And if so, is there in fact a case as one of the solutions to ban social media for up to 16-year-olds as they're doing in Australia from next month?
Yeah, thank you. What I'm going to do is get a couple of questions. We'll definitely answer that one. Just the woman here. So if you could pass the mic sort of 4 rows forward. Here we go. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. I was wondering how far you feel that some of the problem is economic. I mean, so young men clearly feel that they're under pressure to be providers, and even if it turns out that actually there's much more tolerance for a more equal share of financial contribution. If you're a young person facing an economic environment in which you may not have a job at all, or something so insecure, and you can't see that sort of future, you don't grow up in a world where I did, where you sort of saw endless economic growth and the idea that you were going to get richer every year. Kids now really do, they are deeply, deeply frightened, just economically, about the world that they are coming into. So how far is that sort of insecurity and those expectations? It's all very well sort of saying, well, women don't expect men to be the breadwinner, but I think they probably do expect them to contribute. And I do think that does contribute. That does lead to quite a lot of anxiety on their part. So and we also know that young men young women are out earning young men up until motherhood, or until the age where you're likely to have children. So how far is it how far are some of the solutions here just to give young men a bit more economic security?
Okay. What I'm going to do is just see if there are any questions on the side. So there's one here. This is a way of getting steps up. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question about sort of like events like this. Obviously, like they play a role in the discourse. Often I find that they heavily skew towards women, even when the topic you would expect might attract more men. Like, how do we bring more male allies into the fold to have these kind of conversations at this level too?
Thank you. And I'm going to come over here if there's a question. There's a man there, sort of 2 rows from the back. Thank you.
It's really helpful to hear about sort of the development of the online spaces, and especially this idea of sort of stated preferences versus revealed preferences. And I think that's something I've noticed looking at online content, this idea that certain male influencers will say, oh, women say they want a man who's compassionate, but really they don't, right? And that can be sort of a very compelling line in that kind of content. So I was wondering if there is a space for young boys to potentially understand, speak to, couples, young parents who are indeed sharing burdens in terms of financially, housework, etc. Seeing that, learning from that, and understanding, wait, these people do exist, and it is very positive, and it's not something that's some sort of fantasy. Is there space for that, or is that sort of something that seems a little bit impractical? What would you think?
Okay, good question. Now let me just try and shepherd some answers here. Bobby, do you want to take the technical one about the age range?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that age range coincides with the typical definition of Gen Z. So that's kind of the starting point for that. I think it is that there will be gradations within it. And that is one of the problems of any age-based characteristic, particularly in fast-moving technological times like this. But it still does make sense compared to other age ranges. The gaps between that age range and the other age ranges are large and notable. But I think that the difference of experience and what you grow up with is really important for that generational element to it. I would say that some of the learning that we're getting, particularly in mental health, is that it's actually better to look at it all the way through from teens into late 20s rather than putting an artificial break between teens into, earlier on in the 20s. There's a great, it's actually in Australia, great Pat McGorry, who's reshaped the mental health services in Australia to actually take people all the way through that early stage of adulthood into, because there used to be a break at adulthood and you were passed on to different services. So there is some coherence in thinking actually young people are growing up slower in more delayed ways these days, and that thinking about and monitoring people through all of that age range is valuable in its own right. But that's kind of, it's not really what you're asking. You're asking about, is there going to be gradations within that? There definitely will be, and that is just one way to look at it, and we can look at it in lots of different ways, break it down by all of the age ranges. But I would, more as a generational researcher, I would say that coherence of thinking of late teens through to quite a long way into the 20s makes a lot of sense from a policy point of view, as well as from an analytical point of view.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
The job insecurity and caring burden thing. I
Yeah.
just want to say, so yes, I think the reason why we actually need both men and women to take part in the labor market is because, or to take part in like breadwinning, and also at the same time caregiving, because if both don't do caregiving, both can't really go into the labor market in the same extent. And as you say, job insecurity, but also income wages are stagnant. So we need, but also we are seeing one of the highest levels of female labor market participation, mothers' employment, but also mothers' full-time employment due to demand and need. But that is also a reason why we have to have this conversation change, because we can't have men say their job are getting insecure or they're not being paid because of women, because that's not the reason. It's not women going into positions or women getting jobs that they're getting pushed out. It's actually something that both men and women have to come together and maybe fight against companies or push for better rights and better wages together. And this is why almost we need to have that conversation where both men and women, yes, they have to take part. And yes, it has to be that it can't be just men doing the providing for the family, because it is a something that really cuts across everyone, and especially now that young women, and Claire's here so she could tell us more about it, young women have these ambitions to want to have, good careers, but also want to take part in the caring. But just on that note about caring, so it's not, okay, social media is great, male role models are great, but you know what the best role model you can give to a child in terms of that division of labor or sharing the burden? It's the fathers. Every research, it's called gender role transmission. It doesn't matter if you tell your kid, oh, you should be gender equal, you should be a feminist. It doesn't matter how much you say. What you show them in terms of what you do at home makes a heck of a lot more difference in terms of what those kids do, not now, but later on, what kind of partnerships they have, what kind of partner they will become. And we're not giving the fathers opportunities to do that right now. We are not providing them because we don't give them parental leave. We make fathers work very, very long hours because of our corporate culture, of the rise and grind culture. We are not letting boys see their fathers. So forget about the social media. I mean, yes, role models are great and social media is great, but if you're not going to get fathers into the house to actually provide that kind of image, what are we doing?
Okay, so I think we've answered those questions. We haven't answered this question, though, about attracting more men into this conversation. I would note that we do get more men when we have these International Men's Days conversations than other times, so we're already onto something. But any comments on that? More male allies?
That's probably more expert than me. I mean, I would say, as we're kind of seeing in this, our journey on the culture war research, and what it shows that this has only relatively recently emerged as a thing that people were focused on. And I would just say that what we have seen is a brilliant growth in organisations who are focusing more on young men and boys in recent years. And I think we're probably at the start of that journey of having this as a more mix, but there certainly is more activity in looking at this, coming together, talking about it, and trying to, going back to the presentation, keeping those two things in mind at the same time. I think we are getting better at that, but we've only just started. It feels like very much the beginning to me of that conversation.
And we'll need to build out the evidence base about what actually works, because I think there's a lot of activity, but we'll end up knowing more about what is impactful. Yes, please, Chloe.
Yeah, just a great question. I really smiled hearing it for a few reasons. And just I think this work sort of on men and masculinities has existed for a long time in international development spaces, kind of in particular, but it feels newer perhaps here. And I think a couple of things happened in the last few years. I think, Trump was a big kind of moment of, whoa, what's going on with young men, and that certainly was a big part of the reason behind the state of state of American men and leading out state of the world's men. Once Equimundo started to realise that this was, the political piece side of the story was a growing global trend in quite concerning ways. But we're seeing more of that here at the moment, which is great. And more organisations around it, which is again wonderful. I was really smiling as well because I think it can be a tough place, and I feel the tussle kind of personally. My understanding of Equimundo, only joined quite recently, is that as an organisation, I've observed it for a long time, also feels this tussle is that we are very much centred in a gender equality ethos, and it's quite hard to find sometimes the line. How do you sort of centre this work in gender equality and continue to absolutely kind of call for and support the importance of work on women and girls, and that this work is not taking away from women and girls at all. It's, as we've heard, it benefits, as you said in opening remarks, this really benefits everyone, and we have a shared stake in gender equality. But I particularly smiled because the study, as we say, the UK study came out, launched it on Friday, and some of the feedback I had was that it wasn't focusing on women enough, and I was like, oh no, how do I get this line right? So it was really made me smile to hear your, kind of your question that seemed to be the reverse of that, which is actually this still seems to be quite anchored. And so I think this is, there are more organisations, coming into the space, more research, and I think we really need that. We want this to, need this to be evidence driven, but just to know that this is working as a collective, that I think it's important to see this as being sort of very much still grounded and continuing the work with women and girls, because that work is certainly not done. Either. So that was just a thought I wanted to add.
Thank you. We're going to take two more questions and then we're going to have to call it a night. So we'll do it at the front because we went to the back. So we'll do one question here and one question here. So whoever gets the mic first. Yes, please.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about kind of on building relationships in Gen Z specifically, because some recent polling data from Onward showed that they become less politically polarised when they're married, and there's a lot of data on which I think is because you're genuinely communicating with a partner of the opposite gender, rather than just kind of, like we said, social norms tend to be more, they think something different than they actually do. And then Jean Twenge said has done loads of research on how, despite the fact that a lot of young people want relationships, they're having less intimate relationships than before. And so I kind of wanted to ask in this space, in this conversation, why it is that there is an increased anxiousness about young people getting into relationships with people of the other gender, despite the fact that they actually deeply want to. Is it because there's been a cultural shift about the meaning of relationships, or from some research that I did, is that they actually find it, the economic situation, they're so nervous about having children and building a family that then they kind of push it back because it's something that's not seen as feasible as it was before. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Great question. And last question here.
Thank you. Yes, Iris Lamont on the Commonwealth Businessmen's Network Board. Julie, when you were Prime Minister, I remember that you tasked your Sex Discrimination Commissioner to start initiatives. My question is about partnerships. Effective partnerships in this area. You'll remember the Male Champions of Change. And you'll remember your head of the army put out a message that went viral at the time. So, my question is simply, in the messy world we're living in this year, if you were to approach that kind of initiative again, how would you do that? Because that was a really, that inspired work in the UN and the Commonwealth, but that Male Champions of Change working with the private sector, it was effective. it had a life, but what could we do now if we were to take that kind of model?
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is we'll get the questions answered, but we'll also do a last sweep along the panel. So Gideon, I might start with you, and if you've got views on this question, also on the role modelling question, is fine, and we'll sweep on through. Yeah.
I don't have all the answers to the question around relationships. What we do see in our data is that key barriers are both kind of personal and structural. So lack of confidence does just come up. Sort of feeling that there's also a desire for more sort of face-to-face communication, because there's a concern around the role of dating apps and social media. But definitely the structural aspect of it is important as well. Like when we are asking people about settling down and what some of the barriers are, those sort of, which going back to the earlier point about the importance of finances and the economic situation, which I think is absolutely part of the problem. Yes, definitely, like things like housing, childcare, just general economic situation, they are definitely all important as well, and like informing people's decisions about starting a family or not. So you've got both. You need to think about both those aspects. There's the personal and the structural. Both of them are causing issues.
So there is a Vogue article saying, is having a boyfriend embarrassing now? And I mean, so there's a really interesting data we have collected in Korea, which has one of the lowest fertility, the lowest fertility rate, and actually have a really huge decline of people getting married and partnerships. And I think there is the structural issues, economic issues, but also I think there is so some of the data that we find is that actually that there is also an assumption around the opposite gender, like, oh, men are not going to do childcare, oh, men are not going to really be emotionally available, so why bother, type of a thing. And this is why in the US Pew data, and I guess maybe Gideon has some data on that, there are more men who say they want a child and get married, whereas young women are now withdrawing a lot. And I think this again kind of points out what Leah said. We just don't. I mean, there's an assumption, and there is quite a lot of conversations that we had, and we're talking about young men and women, but I think there's also like older men and older men and women. We need actually more spaces to come together and have conversations. Again, across political lines, across kind of gender attitude lines, across migration lines, whatever it is. I think. One of the things we talk about social media, but I think we have kind of put ourselves into silos, and the wonderful people here probably we're also maybe a little bit of an echo chamber as well, but I guess we need more spaces for everyone, and I think it's a real kind of alarm bell to try to ring and try to reimagine what we want as a society, because at the moment, as Bobby said, it doesn't look great.
Okay, what you should take from that is the depth of research that the Global Institute for Women's Leadership knows no bounds, from polling data at the forefront to Vogue articles. We're across all of it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Last comment, if you'd like to respond on the role modelling or on this relationships question.
Yeah. So I think the relationships thing, a lot there. I mean, one thing I am starting to hear, see, and understand a little bit more is around more strategic dating to ensure banks of mum and dad come together. And that is interesting. Interesting, slightly scary, but financial chess almost in that relationship piece, and being very, very strategic with it. And obviously across different cultures, there are different ways that is done. But to see the world of apparently dating autonomy starting to turn into more of a chess matchmaking service is very fascinating. And I just want to highlight on the point around male engagement. Obviously, as an organisation, we spent the last few years really understanding how to engage men in inclusion initiatives in the workplace, how to get them beyond some of the barriers that they have, a lot of which is fear. That again, it's emerging, it continues to change. That fear has increased over the past few years. I think there would be more men in the room in some ways if most of them weren't doing other International Men's Day activities, because I've been invited to like 20 different things. But I chose this because it's a vastly important discussion around how we actively come together to close that divide. But men are deeply susceptible to personalised communications. 91% of leadership books are written by men, and most men that we speak to have very, very little female-led, female-created, female-written content in their lives, which means that, sadly, they are simply more susceptible to opting out of things that even seem or sound like they're from a slightly female gaze. And even the word gender, when we surveyed a lot of men to understand what was the first thing that came to mind, it wasn't men, sadly, even though they are a gender. So yeah, it's sometimes that tailoring of communications, even if the work doesn't necessarily centre on them, because we as an organisation are centred on women's lived experience in the workplace and how men can get more perception of that to be able to make a difference and partner for change. But the comms aspect, we've had to actively tailor that. I don't like to have to cater to a certain group to get them there. But to get them there, we need to at least get them there to see how challenges are interconnected and how they can come together and build a skill set that's actually really valuable in these unpredictable times.
I'm now concerned with this financial chess that we're emerging into Jane Austen world, you know, a man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. We're back there. On this role modelling piece, absolutely hugely important, but I really think the force of this discussion is we can't just uplift or keep doing the models that might have worked even a few short years ago, that how and who and what we're role modelling is really something that we're thinking our way through, what this role modelling around new forms of masculinity is, and that's really the purpose of much of this work and this discussion. So last reflection, and if you on the role modelling question or the relationships question.
Sure, I'll try and briefly do both. But we have a chapter on relationships actually, and I love your question. It's one of my favourite chapters. Some of that data coming out was fascinating. Striking, saddening in some ways, and an overall statistics to share is that 44% of women and men said they'd given up on the idea of a relationship completely, which, I mean, the fact...
So what were those numbers?
44%, women and men, sort of overall numbers, similar numbers said they'd given up on the idea of a relationship completely, which, like, yeah, I mean, I felt that in the room, the response. Same finding in the US as we saw in the UK for young men. 1 in 4 young men believe that no one will ever fall in love with them. It was about 30% for women in the UK, and it's higher for the lower generation, so I appreciated your asking around sort of Gen Z there. I think you touched on some of the really kind of fundamental points. Some of it, I mentioned the statistic around kind of unclear expectations in the sense that, I mean, are they too high expectations? Is it just a lack of clarity? I've had Olivia Dean's song in my head. I was writing the report with Be the Man I Need kind of on repeat in the background. I was like, do we know what that means? You know, like what are we talking about here? Who knows what that means? So there's a sense of expectations being too high. We asked about financial commitment, and there was a sense, particularly among men, that a long-term relationship was too much of a financial commitment. And so there's a lot to unpack in that. I don't know if that's short-term view, long-term view, to come to the economic security question that we had. Another interesting piece that came out was that for folks we asked, have you been in a long-term relationship before? Would you like to be in one again? 71% of men who had been in a long-term relationship before said that they did want to be in one again, so that was encouraging and positive to see. It was slightly lower for women. So something to just, slightly lower, but still like, okay, something to just kind of look at there. And maybe that comes to Heejung's point around like, you know, women are perhaps opting out of some form of long-term relationships and expectations of children because it still feels like it's taking away from other parts of life. And connecting to the care, I promise to keep it short and I will, but connecting to the care piece, we asked about care resourcing. And it's, you know, parents across the sample are making tough choices to be able to resource their care needs. In the UK, we know that childcare costs are astronomical. We know that care for, you know, elderly relatives also astronomical. And those tough choices being made, what did come out, though, was that men, dads, were still more likely to make choices that would keep them away from the home and, you know, working overtime, taking on a second or third income stream, whereas women were still sort of 30% more likely to make decisions that would kind of take them away from work and into the home. So that's reducing work hours, delaying work opportunities, quitting work completely to have more flexible work hours. So there's a big piece to unpack in there. So I think there is a lot to say around kind of relationships in different generations and at different times. There's still a lot of work to be done. And to bringing more men in, I think to the point of, I do take a lot of hope in the friendship piece. And I think if we can meet each other as friends and have tough conversations that are grounded in respect, openness, you know, kind of mutual respect, openness, curiosity, and a real willingness to get to a place of mutual understanding, whether that be kind of, you know, in a coffee shop, third spaces where they exist. I have huge, deep affection for my local coffee shop, whether it be online and gaming spaces, but to find opportunities to have some of those tough conversations in an open, curious, kind of good faith way. I do have hope that, you know, that can help us kind of move through some of this tension.
Thank you. Bobby, last word.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for that question on generational kind of aspect to this. So most of my work on generations is dispelling myths, mostly, that we're not as different as we think. But your instinct is exactly right, that where there is a difference is in economic factors. That is genuinely the case. So that idea of that impacting how people form relationships, how people have children, all of that type of stuff, we know from lots of the work that is absolutely fundamental to declining birth rates and delays in relationships and all those types of things. But within that, though, it's also really important to not put a hard separation between the economic and the cultural, because they're so interrelated. You've got much, much higher chance of people viewing the world as a zero-sum game when they can't see the future, and that is when they're in competition with others. That puts them into competition with others, and we see that echoed again and again through different sorts of culture war framing, so that they're not separate things, they interrelate to each other, and we need to get better at understanding that. I suppose on that theme, I guess the thing that I would really pull out from the research is my own surprise at seeing that loss of optimism generation on generation is almost entirely driven by men's views of their lower optimism from men in their parents' generation. I hadn't really picked up on that so much until we've done this research. So I would take that really seriously. This is because that pessimism is so destructive and so interrelated to other bad trends that we see in other types of ways, that we shouldn't lose that signal from this. But then, given Heejung sort of presented me as a monger of doom, but I don't want to end on that really negative, this isn't all doom and gloom. And I think the one really bright thing from this is if we were following up our trends on men and women's relationship from 2023, if it had gone in the same trajectory as our general things on culture change, we would have seen a much grimmer picture tonight. And what we actually saw, and Heejung showed it, is actually quite a lot of improvements and interconnections, a sense of interconnection between men and women. So my fundamental fear whenever I'm looking at culture wars is anything that looks like it's forming into an identity, where you're on one side, my side or the other side, and they have failed so far. There has been a failure in rolling this into the culture war framing at any kind of scale. So I think if I was trying to keep that sense of optimism and that there is scope for greater connection, is so far those activities have failed in a way that it hasn't failed, unfortunately, in other areas. So we should hold on to that as a more optimistic element.
Thank you. Thank you for ending there. Thank you. Huge thanks to everyone for joining us. Huge thanks to the panel. I've let the discussion go long. You're probably conscious of that. This is longer than you expected to be here, but I thought it was such a rich conversation, it was worth doing that. If you can, please do join us for a drink just in the room, through the double doors, then through the double doors. I think there's a glass of wine to be had. I feel like with the weather, we should be catering a St Bernard with a whiskey thing round its neck to take you home, but the budget at King's doesn't run to that. But feel free to fortify yourself with a glass of wine before you go back out in the cold. Thank you for joining us.